of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, FS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. MEA brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spores, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. MEA is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur les réseaux électriques. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
Mea was founded in 1993 and listed on the AirShare market in 2012. Mea is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Mea is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Mea brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro-color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro-color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Mea is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité. Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
Good morning and welcome to another session of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. The session is available in French and English, and you can access your preferred language via the globe icon on the bottom right side of your screen. We are in July and half of the year is gone. And today, our expert Jim Fitzpatrick will take us through a half-year review of the cashew market demand. But remember that the webinar is streamed live on the ACA Facebook page and ACA YouTube channel, where you can also find the recordings of all past 83 sessions. During the session today, you can ask questions and leave comments in the discussion box below. As usual, we are grateful for our partners and sponsors that are making this webinar possible. I would like to mention the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ MoveCom Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nuts Initiative, and the Cashew Club. But before inviting Jim, I would like to remind you that we are 132 days to the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo, and this year, all roads must lead you to Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, from the November 18th to 21st of this year for the events. Early bird registration is still ongoing and will end on August 31st. Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Stella. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, all good. Looking forward to talking about cashew demand in 2025.
We are ready for the half-year review.
So let's go. Thank you, Stella. We're going to talk today about main focus on demand and consumption in 2025. It's a good time to have a look halfway through the year. Usually, by the end of June, we know the pattern of demand for the rest of the year. So we're going to look forward into 2026 too. Let's see where we're going. You're very welcome to today's webinar. This is our 84th, and we're going to start by talking about markets. Let's have a look at some of the trends in the market. And I think that maybe this market is finding a level. We're talking about cashew kernels, of course, and we've got a little bit more balanced picture than we've seen for some time. So looking at the situation, as usual, looking at the factors that can cause the market to be weak and looking at the factors that can cause the market to be strong. Generally speaking, lower prices, as we've seen over the last 3 weeks or so, have been due to a little bit of a quiet period in kernels buying, and that's for several reasons. Seasonal, first of all, but also some of the uncertainty brought about by the impact of tariffs, but not only that, also brought about by the 2025 crop, which is more and more looking like it could be a record crop when the numbers are all added up. So pressure for lower prices is coming from this seasonal quiet period, an easing of raw cashew nut prices, which has been ongoing, again, a function of production. Add to that a forecast for a very good crop in East Africa, starting from September onwards. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Think about the impact of price rises. So price rises will be starting to hit consumers, particularly in Western markets, from this month onwards. There is a little bit of a time lag between markets moving up and those price rises affecting the retail level. That differs from market to market. When that happens, how it happens. We're going to talk about that too. And finally, what we have seen is a little bit of, whether it's pressure or panic, maybe I'm being a little bit unfair, but a little bit of illogical reaction from some processors knocking down prices into the vacuum. What happens when you knock down prices without much buying interest? The buyers actually back off and you make the situation worse. On the other side of the coin, what could make prices firm up? Well, demand is resilient, as we shall see. The busy season in India, in Europe, in the United States is approaching. It's on us, actually, particularly in the Western markets, but it's coming close in India, and eventually that will be followed by a similar situation for China. Time is running out. Looking at that season, time is running out for processors in India. Diwali, I think, is about 100 days away. 100 days is not a long time in which to assemble, ship, process and distribute cashew kernels for the market in India. Do they have enough? When will they make their final decisions? Other factors that are tending to keep the market steady is the profit margin pressure on processors. It's not easy to make a profit in this market. It's volatile. Kernels prices have been slipping down. RCN prices started the season a little bit too high, but they're coming into line now. Also, there may well be a tendency to process less this year, particularly in Vietnam, but also in other countries. And that too could tend to steady prices. So the situation is a little bit more balanced. In each of the last 3, maybe even 4 ACA global markets with Jim, we talked about the kernels market looking weak. We talked about prices potentially falling. We're coming around to a more balanced situation and a more balanced view now where we think prices are finding their level. Let's have a look at some prices. First of all, we'll have a look at the raw cashew nut situation. And as most people will know, prices have looked a little bit weak, but they seem to have found a level at this point. We are seeing more material coming in. There is still a tendency for prices to drift down, but not as strong as it was. Now, the reason prices are drifting down is because there are still some unsold quantities. Some of that is lower quality. So, for example, if you're looking for a high quality material from Guinea-Bissau, the supply is limited. But if you're looking for lower quality material, 44 pounds, there's still a fair bit of that around in West Africa. RCN prices are beginning to come into line with kernels for the first time in a while. Even though kernels prices have drifted down, you can start to make a calculation now that may well work. So the way I look at it just now is that on the one hand, processors are looking for a reason to make a decision. Time is not on their side. On the other hand, there are cash flow issues. There are cash flow issues in Vietnam, and there are certainly some also in India. So in a falling market, buyers tend to be reluctant, as we've said so many times. If the market steadies, we might see a little bit more activity, but we could see further drifting down of prices on raw cashew nuts, in my opinion. Looking at kernels, well, this situation is a little bit clearer in kernels. Prices have come down a little bit. Whether that's needed or not is another matter, because it hasn't really stimulated a great deal of business. Buyers naturally back off a little bit when prices are coming down. The Western markets have been quiet. The clarity now that's coming around on these US tariffs could make decision making easier. But the impact on demand, if there is any impact on demand, will take time. So when we look at prices at the moment for cashew kernels, I do think they're finding a level. I think there is a limited downside. The only thing to my mind that could change that in terms of a sharp fall in kernels prices would be if Vietnamese processors pushed into a market that really doesn't need to be pushed right now, and that would artificially drop prices, which would be a spectacular buying opportunity, by the way, if it happens. Where are we on prices? Well, let's have a look at the general levels of prices. So here you are, 2020 through to 2025. Current price, or the closing price in black, average price for the year, the low price for the year. And you can see in this year, the range of prices has been around 315, which is where we currently are. And that's a kind of a midpoint price between the top processors and the less reputable processors at the lower prices. Average price for the year, $3.29 FOB. This is for 320s, and it's for the lowest priced origin, which is almost always Vietnam. African cashew kernels are trading at prices 20, 30, in one case 35 cents above these levels at the moment, for reasons we've discussed many times. So if we look at the current range of prices, compared to last year, we're a little bit lower than the closing price and a little bit higher than the average price of last year. It would seem that these low prices of 2022 and 2023 are behind us now, and the market again starts to look something like it looked back 2020, 2021, when we were so rudely interrupted by COVID-19, and even more rudely interrupted then by the impact of inflation and economic problems following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It does seem to me that we are finding a level that's workable for, I won't say all parties, but certainly most parties at the moment. So let's look at the supply side, and let's look at some of the factors on supply, and it all looks good in terms of supply. So if we look at Vietnam, and we look at imports, and of course Vietnam is primarily an importer of raw cashew nuts as opposed to a grower. Highest ever imports for January-June, 1.6 million tons, more than 1.6 million tons, which is a record for the first half of the year, just about a record. The exports, really healthy too, 344,000 tons of kernels. I mean, we need to put perspective on that, and I will do that shortly. Looking at the situation in Cambodia, well, this crop, having already exported 890,000 tons, according to the Vietnamese Customs Authority, this crop is definitely north of 900,000 tons. This is a remarkable achievement. And I think when it comes down to it, we may well be looking at way back to our estimate in February, which was 930,000 tons. So again, Cambodia has a major impact on the international market. Supply side in India, well, so far, by the middle of June, which is the latest number I have, Imports 425,000 tonnes, that's pretty healthy. The crop, I'm still working with 750,000 tonnes as an estimate until somebody categorically tells me that's not right. That would, according to me, that would mean that India needs to import another 450,000, maybe 500,000 tonnes. India may buy more than that, but by my calculations, that's what would be needed. News, well, the news from East Africa is really positive. The Cashew Board of Tanzania estimates that the crop will rise by 20%. That is a huge number, but after last year, I'm not going to argue with anything anyone says on Tanzania. There is remarkable progress. More recently, IAM has come to make a statement that they expect that Mozambique's production for the coming season will be up by 23%. And that too is a remarkable achievement, and that too will weigh heavily on the market. So having seen many years of increased production in West Africa, and then the surge in production in Cambodia from 2020 onwards, we're now seeing something similar, although it is at a slightly lower scale, in East Africa. So positive news on supply. Meanwhile, in West Africa, where the crop is now winding down, the CCA, the regulatory body, is trying to manage what's left unsold on the farms and in the small warehouses in the country. The crop estimate, officially, it's gone up from 900,000 to 1.1 million to 1.3 million. We've always thought it was 1.3 million plus, and we still think that. We think maybe 1.35, it could be more than that. This could be the biggest crop in history. Nigeria, season coming to an end. Looks like good processing volumes in Nigeria this year, according to the sourcing. It's not entirely sure always whether product is going to be processed when it's sourced by processors, because so many of them are also engaged in the export of RCN. Benin, I think the big feature in Benin that's becoming more and more apparent is just the scale of the cross-border trade, and that the export ban has proved to be difficult to implement. Whatever about the good intentions of developing processing and a huge investment in new processing facilities, the management of the supply chain is proving to be extremely difficult. Further west, looking at Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, again, good harvests coming toward the end of the harvest. Senegal appears to have exported more than 100,000 tonnes. Now, Senegal does not grow 100,000 tonnes of cashews, so that means that the border from Guinea-Bissau into Senegal is once again active. Illegal trade. It is a way of solving a problem. Whether it's the right way or not is entirely another story. But 100,000 tonnes from Senegal is a big volume. That means that we'll see a bit less out of Bissau, but it does look like a good crop. Bissau port is now, as it often is, working through an extremely difficult situation. Positive news. And we just finish actually with Brazil, where I just picked up an estimate from IGPE during the week, and they're telling us that they expect the crop to be back down this year, back to about 140,000 tonnes. Last year they came with a final estimate of 161,000 tonnes, so it's about 12% down. Unfortunately, that's kind of a normal crop in Brazil these days. I don't think it has a huge impact on world supply and demand, but it is obviously an important origin. So good news on supply, it's all positive. So where does that leave us? Overall, the situation as I see it is, firstly, really no supply issues, but time is marching on. It's July, festival seasons, not that far away if you take into account what has to be achieved in the meantime. We have issues on logistics. I've mentioned Guinea-Bissau, but there's also issues on logistics in Vietnam, getting containers in and out, and some cash flow pressure has evolved. It's been a typical situation in Vietnam for a while, although that's hard enough to understand given exports are at such high levels, but also imports, and also heavy buying from Cambodia means paying a little bit earlier for the crop than if that material was bought in West Africa, for example. Overall good outlook on the southern hemisphere crops. The tariff situation is becoming clearer, but we can't say that there's clarity, and the negotiation is ongoing. And it is a negotiation. That's what it's all about. It's about a negotiation. So, still, much to be resolved in the month of July. We're almost halfway through now. We are getting some clarity. I think we are getting some clarity on demand. We're getting some clarity on the issues of tariffs, and we're pretty much clear on supply for the Northern Hemisphere. We'll have a look at the Southern Hemisphere. And we will, by the way, do a feature with interviews on the Tanzanian cashew sector early in September. I think it's September 3rd. So looking forward to that. So let's move on then to our major subject for today, which is a review of cashew demand in 2025, in the first half of 2025. And I'd like to start by putting some context on that. We are in a time of booming demand for cashew kernels. Let there be no mistake. We have seen almost 4.5% annual growth in world demand and consumption over the last 10 years. And over the last 5 years, on a global basis, that's been growing by 6.2%. These are very healthy numbers. They're quite big numbers, and they are exceeding many, many other nuts. If you look at the other tree nuts, this growth is fast. Consumption has been growing for 40 years steadily. Every now and again, we get these interruptions. So if we look back at 2011, 2010, 2011, a little bit of an interruption, the financial crisis, we saw a slowdown in growth in 2018 following the high prices of the previous 3 years, and we saw the COVID impact in 2020. So there have been one or two shocks or interruptions: financial crisis, low production, high price, COVID, inflation, economic shock of 2022. Let's have a look at cashew consumption by region. So when we look at the world, we see that cashew consumption is really dominated by 4 areas. By far the leader is India, 31, 32%, depending on how you calculate it, over the last 2 to 3 years, and that looks set to grow. North America, around 20%, that includes Canada and Mexico. Europe, Western and Eastern Europe, around 19%. And upcoming, quickly, China with last year around about 11%. So what we're seeing is, we're seeing a relatively consolidated market. 3 markets, India, the European Union and the United States, account for 68% of cashew consumption, most of which is imports. If you add China to that, almost 80% of consumption in those 4 markets. India, the United States, Europe, particularly the European Union, and of course, China. Elsewhere, demand is relatively fragmented. You can see there are significant markets in East Asia, in West Asia, particularly in the Gulf countries, but 80% of consumption is in those 4 regions. And they operate on different drivers. So when we look across, so I thought let's have a look at what drives consumption. So I talked to 1 or 2 people. I looked at some of the presentations from various conferences, and we can see that there are things in common across many areas. Convenience and snacking is growing in almost all markets. The focus on health and how tree nuts and cashews can be good for you, or perceived as good for you, are a good alternative to other sources of nutrition. These are all really important factors. In some markets, like India, cashews play a very big part in gifting and snacking and general cooking. In markets like Europe or China, cashews play an important role in convenience, in snacking, but also now in changing patterns of eating. What we also see in these markets is that the economic conditions can influence consumption. So if we think about 2022 or we think about 2011, economic difficulties in Western countries, and we saw a dip in demand in the United States, and we saw a dip in demand in Europe, much less in Europe than in the United States. So it seems realistic to say that across all of these markets, what's missing? What's missing is price. Price doesn't appear to make a huge difference. What makes a big difference is if there's a significant downturn in the market, and we'll come to that. So let's have a look at what's been going on in the long-term trends. And what we're seeing is that the growth in cashew demand is shifting or has shifted to Asia. Like a lot of economic power, it is shifting from Western countries to Asia. And what we see, for example, is high rates of growth in consumption of cashew nuts in China. 5-year compound annual growth rate in China, 13.2%. Compare that to Western Europe at 4.6%, which is strong. 4.6% is very strong growth, but 13.2 in China or 12.9 in West Asia and North Africa. That's the region that some people used to call the Middle East. We're seeing fast growth, accelerating growth from the 10-year trend to the 5-year trend. We see this accelerated growth. Fastest growing markets are China, West Asia, North Africa, and India. East Asia is also growing, but from a lower level. So what we're seeing is that over the next 10 years or so, these markets in China, West Asia, and East Asia will start to dominate. India is already in that position and still is growing quickly, remarkably. So the role of markets like the US market will diminish in the coming years. The European market is, as I'm going to talk about in a while, is defying the trend. It's not going where other Western markets have been going. It continues upwards, and that's for very particular reasons. Strong growth. Where do people buy their cashew nuts? Which countries do they source them from? Well, let's have a look. So if we look at Europe, or the European Union, still huge quantity from Vietnam. 72% in 2024 was sourced in Vietnam. But noticeably, the number for Africa has been increasing. So last year, 20%. First 4 months of this year, it's gone up to 21%. Exports from Côte d'Ivoire to Europe this year have exploded. So we're looking at increasing share of African processors in the European Union market. If we look at the US market, much bigger share for Vietnam, 89%. So US buys 89% of its cashew kernels from Vietnam. Only 6% from Africa, and surprisingly nowadays only 3% from Brazil, virtually nothing from India, and a small proportion from other countries. So the US, highly concentrated supply. Europe, highly concentrated supply, but changing. US, highly concentrated supply, but not changing in any significant fashion. In fact, Africa's share of the US market has fallen in 2025, in contrast to what's going on in Europe. What about China? Well, as you would expect, the links between China and Vietnam, the proximity, means that almost all of China's cashews are sourced in Vietnam. It makes perfect sense. But noticeably, there is a small share emerging for African countries are around about 5%, and that has been increasing. And in the fourth of our big markets, India, now we're talking raw cashew nuts. So the other three are all kernels. India imports raw cashew nuts. It does not import kernels in any volume. No surprise, India sources most of its raw cashew nuts from African countries and grows about 41% of the cashews that it processes. So last year, this figure would have been less because the Indian crop was lower. Go back 3 or 4 years when the Indian crop was over 800,000 tons, and this figure will be more. And that's what happens in terms of the balance between imported and domestic sourced. So what we're seeing is in the main producing regions, in the main consuming regions, Vietnam dominates. It's only a question of by how much. We're seeing that changing in Europe, but for now, not really changing anywhere else. So that means that Vietnam gives us, and Vietnam trade figures give us a very good idea of where consumption is going, where trade is going in any given year. And we're going to look at the first half of this year, 2025. So let's start by looking at June. Vietnam's exports of cashew kernels in June were the highest ever for a month of June. And you can go back to 2017 and you see something that's remarkable. In 2017, 34,000 tons were exported in the month of June. In 2025, that figure was almost 68,000 tons. That's an expression of what I mean when I talk about the boom in cashew demand that we've been seeing. And if you look at the month of June, so here's January 2021 through to June 2025, every month's exports with June highlighted in each of the 5 years. And what you tend to see in that is that June is not necessarily the biggest month of the year, but it is one of the biggest months of the year. And it is maybe a good indicator of what's to come. So if we go back to 2022, we saw June was a little bit lower and the rest of the year followed in that pattern. If we look in 2023, June was a little bit higher than previous months and off it went from there. 2024 is a bit different. 2024 is a bit different because we had huge US imports during 2024 for the reason of tariffs. So if we look at the annual trend, what we see is early in the year, market relatively low exports from Vietnam. This steadies up, and by June, you tend to see the pattern emerging for the year. It's either an upward pattern or it's a downward pattern, or as in 2022, it's a kind of a steady pattern. So when we look at this situation, we're looking at a very healthy performance in the month of June. Let's have a look at the situation for the half year. So this again, Vietnam's exports first half of 2025, January, June, and here's your comparison all the way back to 2017. And it's remarkable. Again, just to reiterate, 344,000 tons in January to June 2025 compared to 150,000 tons, less than half, back in 2017. None of us could have foreseen that. This year, first half of the year, slightly down. It's down about 1% on last year, 344,000 tons versus 348, but significantly up on 2023. So it's 24% higher in the first half of the year than 2023, higher again than the 2022 figure. Actually, there's only 1 year that's exceeded first half, and that was last year. This again looks like a pretty healthy trend to me. If we look at the situation comparing the cumulative, so the red bars, January, February, March, April, May, June, those are the bars that make up this half year exports month by month, and the lines track what happened in the previous 4 years. So here we have in red 2025, and you can see half year 2024 slightly ahead of this year. Now, contrast that to what might happen. So when we look at this trend, it's obviously very healthy. When we look at it and we look back at 2023, which is this dark line, we see that although 2023 was below 2024 or 2025, it did accelerate afterwards and very healthy export number. Contrast that with 2022, where it slowed down in the second half of the year. That happened because of the economic impact of inflation, especially energy costs, especially in Western markets, particularly Europe and the United States. And that impact has slowed exports down in 2022. So we might be better to look at the economic impact of the current situation rather than the impact of prices. But let's continue and let's look still at Vietnam in the first half of the year. And here you have it month by month. So what we've seen this year is exports. So this is the percentage change of exports 2025 versus 2024 comparison month by month. So January 2025 exports were 42% less than 2024. Couple of factors at play. Huge 2024 exports at the end of the year and the calendar. So the timing of New Year's celebrations, the timing of Tet in Vietnam obviously has an impact on shipments. After January, we see a pretty strong recovery, 8% higher, 5% lower, 10% higher. Really strong May. Some people say related to US tariffs, I'm not so sure. And a really strong June. So 4 out of 6 months are better than last year after a very slow start. But the very slow start was in the month that is generally one of the lowest months of the year for exports. If we look at this comparison over the year and we track month by month exports, January to December, we see that looking at 2024, 2023, the dotted blue line, and 2022, the orange line, what we see is that after June, there tends to be a relatively steady pattern. So the trend tends to be set in the first half of the year. Why is that? That's because so many buyers buy forward. And buying forward, then the contracts get executed. So whereas you might see some volatility in September, and that's happened in all 3 of the previous years looked at, the general trend throughout the year is set in the first half. So we wouldn't expect any major volatility. Now this May, really high figure for May, this pickup in Vietnamese exports, it's arguable. Is that about the shipments of cargo to the United States to avoid higher tariffs? It may be, it may not be. But it is a fact. And if you look at the shipments directly to the United States, it's actually not the United States that's driving this. When you look at May and indeed June, what you do see is really strong shipments to China, really strong shipments to Europe. So when we get all this news about tariffs and the chat around that, it's very easy to become just focused on one issue. Other markets are really strong right now. Other markets, in terms of their demand, are moving along very strong. Let's have a look at some of those markets. So I break it down into different regions. China, the US and Canada, the top 10 in Europe, the top 6 in West Asia, and then East and Central Asia. So let's have a look at the comparison the last 3 years for January, June. So if we look at China, what we see is an increase in Vietnam's exports to China in the first half of the year of 28%. Quite remarkable. And it's not just 1 year. We saw precisely the same pattern last year, a big jump, and now we see another big jump. There's clearly something going on demand for tree nuts, demand for cashew nuts in China. If we look at the US and Canada, we see a different situation. Whereas last year we saw a real peak and almost 100,000 tonnes in the first half of the year, that's back down again this year. Some of this 100,000 tonnes falls over into 2025. That's part of the explanation. But interestingly, it's not that far behind the 2023 figure. So although it's 25% down on last year, it's only about 5,000 tonnes down on the previous year. So this doesn't really suggest that there is any underlying problem with US and Canadian demand. What it suggests is that there may be technical factors at play. Looking at Europe, again, European shipments from Vietnam down about 3%. The figures are small. We see good growth into 2024. Essentially, that's consolidated in 2025. It's less than 2,000 tonnes of a difference. This could be corrected anytime. But nevertheless, a strong trend. West Asia moving up. So West Asia would be Turkey, Emirates, Saudi Arabia, all of those markets. I include Egypt in there, that general group of markets that buy in similar fashion, use the cashews for similar products. And there we're also seeing growth. That's about 6.5% growth year on year. And again, it's part of a strong trend. In East Asia, so East and Central Asia, so now we're talking about every country from Kazakhstan to Japan. I've included Oceania in there, and we're seeing something of a correction. So we're back to 2023 levels. All of these numbers look healthy, bar one, and that's the US market. So when we look generally at demand, what we can say as a broad trend for January, June 2025 is that it is very healthy, that the US demand is significantly down, but that may be due to what we're going to call technical factors. I'll talk a bit about that again, related perhaps to tariffs and potential trade war. Let's continue with our discussion on Vietnam. So here's a chart. I'm not going to go into this too much, but I thought it's worth showing it to you. So here is the every month exports from Vietnam of cashew kernels from January 21 through to June 2025, month by month. And then you've got the 3-month moving average. So you can see the seasonal trend, again, underlining the fact that the first half of the year sets the trend, the second half of the year follows through on it. This year, we saw a very slow start to the year, and we've seen this significant increase to balance it. Looking at price, so the red line is the FOB price for 320s. There's the axis on the right-hand side that tells you which price is which. And we can track the prices through a spike in 2021 on demand, and then the low prices following the shutting off really of demand growth in 2022, low period of prices, and then that major correction we saw last year on lower production and disruption in the supply chain. That's followed through with a little bit of volatility, this range that we spoke about earlier, 345 to 315, and we've seen that range there. So we get an overcorrection, it corrects back, and now we're seeing this slight downtrend in recent weeks. We're still well above the 5-year average. We're well above the 2-year average. Relatively healthy, and it looks relatively steady. But what we notice in this is that the impact of lower prices on demand on exports is not immediate. There is a time lag. People, I was saying to someone this week that a lot of people in our business think like traders, but roasters, many importers, supermarkets, they don't think like traders. They're business people. They're not looking for a speculative opportunity. They look at the market, they make their decisions when the time comes. So that tends to mean that the impact of lower prices, so look at the second half of 2022, Prices came down sharply. When did imports start to pick up? Second half of the following year. That steady price trend, they're low prices, but they're relatively stable prices. It lacks volatility in that period. That caused strong export performance in the first half of the year. Then the higher prices started to bite in later. So different markets, you get different reaction, and it takes different time for that to happen. So we shouldn't expect, if prices come down, an immediate reaction in demand. There may be no reaction in demand, depending on the price level, depending on the circumstances. And as we saw a little bit earlier, depending on what are the drivers of the growth of demand in particular markets. So it looks, for example, as if European consumers are buying cashews regardless of the price. Maybe it's not growing as quickly when prices are high as when prices are low. Maybe the market is more influenced by volatile prices and by changes in price, because no business can plan when prices are volatile. So whereas if you think like a trader, you love volatility. That's what can make you money. But if you think like a supermarket or a roaster or a manufacturer or a processor, what you want is steady, predictable markets. So let's look at, having looked at the biggest supply origin, 89% of the US supply comes from Vietnam. Let's have a look at the US market. It is constantly in the news. I think that's the way they like it to be. Let's have a look at how that market has been trending. And first of all, we look over the long term. So what have we got in this chart? You've got the yellow bars, the imports of what I just call now natural cashew kernels. So that's the HS code 080132. That's what we call WW320s, for example. And you've got processed, which is the brown bars. The processed is roasted. Now I focus on this tariff heading. There are others, but this is where the bulk of processed cashews come into the United States. So what we're seeing is relatively strong trend in demand over the longer period, a very strong growth trend in processed cashews, although it's still quite low. It's about 45,000 tons out of well over 200,000 tons. And what we see in the US is a modest growth trend for natural cashew kernels, about 1.25% growth over the last 5 years. Now in 2022 and in 2023, we saw, due to inflation, due to the economics in the United States and elsewhere, we saw a fall away in imports of cashew kernels. The market was pretty slow in that period. So it didn't, to go back to my initial point, it didn't react to low prices quickly. If it were to react to low prices quickly, then 2022 and 2023 imports would have shot up. But they did the following year, last year. So we know that US consumption was up last year. We also know US imports were up, but they were up by more than consumption. So if we look at processed and natural, we look at the total trend, what we're seeing is a growth rate over the last 5 years of about 4%, 3.9% exactly. And this period, 2021 through to 2024, has been quite a volatile period. And if we look at the first half of 2025, we'll now see how that figures out this year. So we saw, again, similar to the chart I showed you on Vietnam, 4 months of 2025 imports, and then the full year for 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024 is in there as well, tracking on top of 2021. If we look at this, what we see is February, March, April imports significantly down. January to April, the 4 months, down by 20% compared to last year. Now this is significant. This January-April period is the lowest imports of cashew kernels into the United States since 2016, and that's a long time ago. Contrast that with Europe, where the first quarter of the year was the all-time high. So what we're looking at here is high imports in 2024. So imports in 2024 were up by 23%. Consumption, the only figure I have is for supermarkets. Sales in supermarkets were up by 7%. So 23% up on imports, 7% up on supermarket sales. That leaves a lot of inventory at the end of the year. I think that was naturally deliberate as a management of the risk of the introductions of tariffs, or at least the uncertainty on that. So what we're seeing is lower imports for obvious reasons. Let's have a look at the bigger picture, and let's try and fit that into the context of 2025. So here are the US imports, as I've shown you over a long period since 2011, and I've added in the average annual FOB price for 320s in that period. Let's have a look at some of the trends. So if we go back this period, when we saw good import growth, steady prices, pricing, not too much volatility, imports grew significantly. Trends in healthy eating and convenience were also strong in that period. That was followed by a period of high prices during which we saw no growth in imports. 16 was down a little, 17, 18, 19, basically no growth. Looking forward, we got a little bit of a spike in 2021. That was based on COVID and lockdowns. And then in 2022, we saw low prices, but an economic slump. High levels of inflation, rising food inflation, rising energy inflation. We're talking about the United States, but that affected most markets too. And then we saw in 2024, this big spike in imports based on increased consumption, yes, but also on inventory building. So looking at these factors and looking at what we're seeing so far this year, shipments from Vietnam, January, June, imports into the United States, we think we're putting in a number now of a decrease of 15 on last year. We actually had, because if 8% drop versus 2024, you still end up higher than 2023. There's still maybe 8%, but there is quite a lot to be read into this situation. Let's look at how the US market behaved during periods of price volatility. What you see in front is increase in US compared to the year before for 2010 all the way through to 2024. So by how much did imports go up or down in any given year? And what you see with that is, so what we're trying to look at here is how do imports into the United States respond to changes in price, to price volatility. And one thing is clear, when you get very high prices here in the middle of the last decade, the growth in imports is slow. But it's not negative. It's still positive. So even in 2019 and 2020, we saw growth on 2018. Essentially, the market recovered from the high price period and grew. Then came COVID, it grew sharply. Then came inflation, economic problem, big crash in imports, followed by another recovery. So if we look back, what we see is 2011, financial crisis, a contraction in the market, 2022, inflation, economic crisis, contraction in the market, and of course in 2021, when price started to get the realms of reality. This is 25 FOB, by the way, all the way up here, when it got to the very top, and the average for the year was something like 480. So what we're seeing is, in my view, is that imports into the United States react slowly to price changes, but quickly to economic crises. So probably if you think it down to the personal level, the buying agent, the person responsible or the group responsible for purchasing cashews understands the market. They react to the market. They react to their customers. But when it comes to a financial crisis and maybe the main board or the Treasury Department calls up and says, stop buying, we've got an economic crisis here, then you see this fast reaction. So for me, when we look at this year and we look at tariffs, the key question is not the price increase that will be caused by tariffs. It is what will be the economic impact on the United States market. So if the US, as a result of import tariffs, were to go into a recession, if we were to see high food inflation return, then I think we would have a significant impact on cashew demand. But because that's more likely to impact next year, I think that we're going to see the worst impact of this, if there is to be an impact, in the early part of next year. So for now, although we're looking at reduced imports, and we're not going to see, I do not believe we're not going to see the importers surge in their buying in July or August because they know where the tariffs will be. There's a lot more to be figured out before we get to that position. So what about tariffs? And this is not something I'd planned to talk about today, but I added it in as an afterthought on the basis that it is evoking so much chat in the market. If we think about US tariffs, first of all, what are tariffs? So they're a tax on imports, a tax on imports, not on exports, on imports, to make domestic product. Now you might ask, why would you tax cocoa or coffees, products that you cannot grow in the United States? Well, I wonder the same. Why would you do that? But it's all part of this package and it's all part of this negotiation. What do tariffs do? Well, they cause a price increase, and that would mean that retail prices would be expected to rise. But also this year, for various reasons, including tariffs, the US dollar is down about 10% in value, and that has a huge effect on the ability of US companies to buy and US consumers to afford imported food products. So if we think of the impact of a weak dollar and the impact of tariffs, we're looking at a major change in price. Now that's not seen in the short term because most trading in cashew nuts is done in dollars anyway, and all trading into the United States is done in dollars. So it's not directly relatable, but over time it does have an impact. What's going on? Well, this is a negotiation. The US administration promised, their words, 90 deals in 90 days. So far, I was reading this morning, they've only done 9 deals. So what have they done is they've extended the period. Now, many people say that this is going to turn out to be a protracted series of extensions. So it'll be 10% duty until the 1st of August. That'll be extended. Some people will negotiate. But one interesting commentator this morning was writing that her thought is that this will just peter out longer and longer and longer negotiations and discussions, and that in time, other countries' position on the negotiation will become more entrenched. So although we now have an announcement, we don't have a resolution. We need to watch this carefully. Add to that, when you look at some of the documentation, the discussion on agricultural products is not finalized. So even in the agreement with Vietnam, which put the 20% tariffs in place, it says that there is room to revise the situation on agricultural products. And we may see something change there. Interestingly, Vietnam buys quite a bit of agricultural products from the United States. So there is a little bit of a reciprocal, genuinely reciprocal aspect to that. Other point, the transshipment tariffs, this 40%, people have been commenting that this could apply to African or Cambodian cashews processed in Vietnam. I don't think so. Myself, looking at the rules around this, first of all, for 30 years, the US has accepted cashew kernels that were grown in Africa or in Cambodia as Vietnamese origin when they're processed in Vietnam. If you look at the World Trade Organization, you will see that they talk about a substantial transformation. And it seems to me that that's the case. So I don't think that this 40% transshipment rule is much danger to the trade of raw cashew nuts to Vietnam. There are plenty of other things that are a danger to that, but not this. Most African countries, for context, we should remember, most African countries already tax raw cashew nuts. Okay, that's it. So we're getting the interpretation across on the English channel also. If you could have a look at that, guys, please. India tax to the point where they're priced out of the Indian market. So taxation in the cashew sector is not new. But if we think about it, if raw cashew nuts are taxed on export from African countries and they're then taxed on import into the United States, the government, cumulative government take on cashews grown by smallholders could be the impact of tariffs. Well, first of all, there's a differentiation between countries. So when you look at the percentage rates, these are what they call ad valorem taxes, so it's by the value of the product, from 36% for Cambodia down to 10% for countries like Benin, Tanzania, and Brazil. There's quite a difference there. So let's look at the impact of tariffs. Let's first of all look at, in black and white, the reality, the facts of the matter. The US consumes about 20% of the world's cashews and importantly uses a wide variety of grades. So we in Europe, we don't use a lot of broken cashews, but in the United States they do. Secondly, as we mentioned, the US almost exclusively buys from Vietnam, 89% from Vietnam. It's a slow growing, mature market, or it has been up to now. It's not a market that we would expect a dynamic growth. After the initial shock, if you like, of tariffs, where we saw a slowdown in buying, we've now seen less forward buying as the year has gone on, as the situation has been less and less clear. Those are the facts of the matter. In grey, we have a number of other factors that are significant in terms of the impact. First of all, there is a difficulty allocating costs. Contracts often sold delivered. How do you allocate the tariffs? Who is it? In theory, it should be the importer. In fact, that would put the importer out of business. So how does that work out? And that needs to be resolved. Secondly, it's going to cause flow pressure. This tariffs, you're looking at something like $3,000 of import taxation on a landing container 20s that has to be paid. Go particularly patient. I noted looking at the figures today that the US Treasury coffers are filling up with the funds generated by tariffs. So cash flow pressure for importers and for others too. And then, of course, the big factor, in my opinion, is that the economic impact of tariffs could well reduce demand. That takes a little bit longer to play out. So if we get a situation where the US economy is negatively impacted, or you get strong food inflation, for example, you could see a situation where the economy slows down. On the other hand, the US produces most of its own food. It's just in certain segments, fruit and vegetables, for example, it's a big importer. So whether or not and to what extent that will affect the overall economy remains to be seen. But these impacts are significant, and they're more than significant in the way we think about the market and the way it's changed the market sentiment. Now, we also see a lot of people online talking about, could this create a competitive advantage? So if Vietnam is paying a 20% tariff, there it is there on the chart, does that mean that Mozambique, Nigeria, Benin, Tanzania, and Brazil all have a competitive advantage? it's not sure, because don't forget that most of the African cashew kernels are already trading at premium prices to Vietnam. Most of the processing, about 65% of the processing in Africa, is in Côte d'Ivoire, which actually on paper will have a higher level of tariff than Vietnam from August. So it is probable that we will not see a surge of US importers coming to African countries, changing what they've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years, coming to African countries to buy. It seems unlikely to me that there will be a big advantage in that. There's no advantage for India with its 26% rate, certainly no advantage for Indonesia or Cambodia with these tariffs in the US market. So that means they need to look at other markets, or they need to somehow get their tariffs down to a fair level. Now, I said 9 deals out of 90 promised done, so there's a long way to go on this road. But looking at it, it does seem to me that the biggest impact of tariffs in the short term is the impact on the sentiment of the market, the impact on reduced interest in forward buying, but that is going to impact next year much more than this year. If the US goes into recession, bigger problem. That's a much bigger problem than an increase. Our business is used to increase in prices. That's been happening forever. I've been in this business many years, and it goes up, it goes down. Demand has always grown. When you get a big economic issue, then you see the interruption. That's the US market. That's some discussion about tariffs. Interested to hear your comments or questions at the end. Let's have a look at other markets. Let's see how other markets are behaving this year and how they will perform after prices have risen, as we saw last year. Well, here's India. Same chart. The growth or decline in a couple of cases in the Indian market. And what you see in the Indian market is growth every year, bar 2. And those 2 years were, well, COVID, not surprising, and 2010, financial crisis. Again, not that surprising. But the Indian market just continues to grow. And when it grows slowly, it then balances it by taking a little bit of a growth surge. When you see high prices in the international market, and bear in mind that the Indian market is higher than this anyway, market prices in India are much higher than the rest of the world, India keeps growing. So I think we can expect to see India to continue to grow. If we were to see an economic crisis in India, maybe it slows down, but we will still see growth. Growing population, growing affluence, growing interest in this product. And don't forget that if it's more difficult to import other tree nuts from the United States, there's not much change in the availability of cashews, and there's certainly no change in the tariff regime for the import of raw cashew nuts into India. Look in the European market. I've said it's pretty strong, and here we have same thing. So annual growth in the European market in percentage terms, and we have seen some really strong growth over the years compared to the price of 320s. Again, we see a reaction to economic crisis early in the last decade and in 2022 in response to surging inflation following the war in Ukraine. I think what we see in Europe is very strong growth, and other things than price are driving this. Lower price doesn't actually accelerate growth in Europe. It may mean more imports a little bit here or there, but the underlying trends are very strong. The market is still developing. Don't forget that there are high consuming markets like Germany, for example, but there are also fast growing markets like Poland. So Europe is a lot of different markets developing at different speeds now. This year, imports into the European Union between January and April were up by 10.5%. That's pretty significant. That looks pretty positive for 2025. Let's have a look at China. So I've put China and West Asia or the Middle East on the same chart. China is the red bars. And what we see in the Chinese market is a very volatile pattern. And this would appear to respond to price, at least up till now. So what we've seen over the years is high price, decline in imports, recovery, low price, surge in imports, the interruption of COVID, which throws all of our charts a little bit out, decline in 2022 as elsewhere, but look at 2023, 2024, and this year, 20%, more than 20% up already. We are seeing China in a fast growth phase. And I think if we can track this growth phase back pre-COVID, but it was clearly interrupted by COVID. China was badly hit, lockdowns were pretty severe in China, and that had an impact on demand. But what we've seen since is a surge in demand. If China was to continue to grow at these rates, within 7 years, it will be the same size as the United States market. And that really puts it into context. Middle Eastern markets or West Asia, we're again seeing strong growth, but again, great price sensitivity. So I think because this market tends not to buy forward, and because a lot of the imports are redistributed around the region, so it might be bought by the UAE, but it might then be resold into Iraq or Syria or various countries around the region, we see this sensitivity to price. Much more trading culture in the business there too. So 2017-18, in response to high prices, big fall in growth. And we're not talking here, to remind you, we're talking about the level of growth. So we're reading the trend based on the speed of growth in the market, not on the actual absolute imports. The absolute imports the numbers would look a little bit less dramatic than these. So we saw a 30%, almost % drop in 2018 following high prices in the previous 2 years. And then during the low price period, strong growth, and that slowed down a little bit last year. Why did it slow down? Because this market seems to respond to price changes a little bit more quickly than markets in Europe or the United States, or even in China. So when we look at this, we're looking at two fast-growing markets. I think we said the West Asia market's growing at about 6.5%. China's growing in the teens, growing very quickly. A certain sensitivity to price, much more so in the Middle East market, which accounts for about 8% of world consumption, than in the Chinese market, which accounts for, last year, about 11% of world consumption, but growing quickly. So if we look at this, and if we take all these trends, let's now take one step back and look at the supply-demand balance over the last 10 years and what's affected it. So again, you see and balance very simply for this chart is how much was produced, how much was consumed. And consumption is used, the calculation is generally based on imports. So if it was in stock in Rotterdam at the end of the year, for this calculation, it's consumed. So what we see is in blue, years of surplus, and in red, years of deficit. So we can see a trend. So we can see several years of deficit. We can see several years when demand was growing faster than production, resulting in deficits. That doesn't mean we ran out of cashews, not at all. We always have stocks from one year to carry into the next. I'll come to that in a minute. So demand growing faster than production in this period, poor crops in 2015, 2016. We see the demand response. So the demand response comes in 2018 when much more was produced than was consumed. So we see that trend start to emerge. But what's noticeable is it takes some time to emerge. Move far forward into 2020, 2021, and we see this Cambodian production surge. And we see big production in Cambodia coming to the market. And of course, that creates a surplus on paper. What happened 2022, 2023? Cambodian production surge, slower demand, especially in Europe and North America. We get this big surplus production start to emerge. Now, I say a big surplus, but let's just put that into context. We're talking at its height about 100,000 tons of kernels. 100,000 tons of kernels is about 10% of consumption. So we're not talking about huge volumes weighing on the market. What we're talking about is surpluses ranging from something like 8% shortage to 10% surplus. So this has a huge effect on price. So relatively minor movements have huge effects on price. And that's what we've seen over many years in cashews. Bring ourselves forward to 2025. Now we're talking in estimates and forecasts, and we see a big crop, US demand slowing down for the reasons we've discussed, and again, a surplus emerges. So in this case, the surplus means what was produced, what was consumed that year. It doesn't take into account stocks. So the forecast now, this one, which forecasts a surplus at the end of the year, this assumes a drop in US imports of 15%, that China and India continue on the trend they've been on, that there's no growth in the Middle East because of the higher prices, and that Europe continues to grow, but slips back a little bit to about 4%. So it slips back to about 60% of its average growth rate of the last 5 years. That creates a surplus at the end of the year. Now let's try and put that into the context of the market. So here we have market pricing over the years. And again, you can see a series of demand growing faster than production, poor crops, high price. Price gets a reaction, demand responds to the high price by falling. You get a good crop in 17-18, the calendar year, the crop doesn't respect the calendar year, so it's a 17-18 crop. Prices start to fall. You get again in 2019, because of lower production, you get a surplus. That diminishes during COVID. You get a deficit rather, that diminishes during COVID. And back we go. Cambodia comes online and prices come down again. So what we see is relatively slow response of price to supply and demand. It takes 2 or 3 years. It takes several poor crops and strong demand to impact price in this kind of a dramatic fashion. How is that managed? Well, we look at the inventory. So adding into the chart now, we still have our surplus, our deficit. We still have our 320 price, and now we have the rolling level of inventory. What was left over the period? Why did the market go so high in 16, 17? Because the crops were lower, the demand was strong, and there wasn't enough rolling inventory to keep the market supplied. Prices shot up. Following on toward more recent times, and because of the introduction of Cambodia, as everyone knows, high stocks of raw cashew nuts in Vietnam and in India at the end of 22 into 23 and 23 into 24, a little less, and now that's diminished last year. But again, we will see relatively high stock. Now, there is a fact about this that needs to be noted. These are calculations. The surplus doesn't always impact prices because not all production gets to market. And I think this could happen this year. That it could be that a certain amount of the production in West African countries never actually makes it to the market, is never actually processed, and certainly not processed in this year, which would have no impact on kernels prices. Is this a big shock to the market? Not really, because when we look at the calculated surplus versus the typical surplus, it is a lot of material, but this has become a very big market, and what we're looking at is a surplus of about 40 to 50 days consumption. That can certainly stop prices going up, but it doesn't necessarily mean that prices will fall below $3 down toward those levels that we saw in 2022 and in 2023. So outlook, this is the way I'm seeing it. 2025 ends with the surplus, but the surplus may not make it to market. Some of it may be left at origin, and some of it may be reinvented as 2026 crop. Some of it may never get processed. There could be a reduction in processing volumes in Vietnam, and that would reduce any surplus on kernels. So because there's a surplus of production over consumption, as we've seen in the past, doesn't necessarily mean that cashew kernels prices go into any kind of sharp fall. We've already seen a correction. We may not see much more of a correction as I'm seeing it. The impact in this year will be limited, and it'll be limited this year because of the timing. We still don't have clarity on US market attitude, but we do for elsewhere, which is strong, and we have additional costs. So costs for processors have been rising. Their ability to sell at lower prices is now again restricted, and hopefully their management of the market is too. But the impact of that surplus will be felt next year, in 2026. If the East African crop is as good as expected, or as forecast by the authorities in Mozambique and in Tanzania, and if the 2026 crops are good crops, they don't need to be as big as this year, but provided we have good crops, then we will see the impact. But these surpluses are not at levels that take years to work out. This is not like if you were involved in pepper a few years ago, you will know that there was a big surplus that's taken years to resolve. It's not that. It is a maybe 10%, 12% surplus, which can be relatively quickly managed. What will determine the next move? Well, I think we're looking at, in July, how the processors manage the market. I don't think we're going to see any resolution on tariffs or any big demand in the month of July. In August, it'll be about Indian demand and whether or not the US does tariff deals or extends again. In September, we start to focus on East African crops, Tanzania, Brazil too, to a lesser extent. October, we're looking at Mozambique, but we're mostly looking at demand in October. How did Diwali go, or how is Diwali going in India at that stage? Demand in the European Union, and especially demand in China. And in November, we're then looking at how Southern Hemisphere crops have fared. Brazil, Indonesia, Tanzania, Mozambique, how that supply has come to the market. Is it as big as expected? Are we going to see a 20% increase in the Tanzanian crop, a 23% increase in Mozambique? If we do, these are big numbers, and these will make a difference. What could disrupt this? Bad outcome on tariffs. If some countries end up with very high tariffs into the US, that would cut off 20% of the market. I think an unexpected weakness in the Indian rupee. We see some chat about the Indian rupee and the rates. A recession tendency, particularly in North America, but it's also possible elsewhere. And of course, always the weather in producing countries, which can affect production. So I think we're looking at not a particularly volatile period ahead, but there are some elements in there that could impact the market and could cause some price volatility in the coming months. It's not a time to speculate, in my opinion. It's a time for careful market management. That's a view on demand in the first half of the year. Next time, we're going to have a look at the longer term, and we're going to see what's long-term in store for production and demand of cashews. But for now, thank you for attending today. Thank you for listening. And I'll pass you back to Stella. Let's see if there are any comments or any questions. Stella.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much for the presentation today. It was insightful as usual. Yes, we have a couple of comments and questions. The first one is coming from Joseph Dosso, who is writing from Benin, and he's asking if you could please share with us a little bit more about the tariffs. I think you wishes you could go back to the slide.
Yeah, by all means, Joseph. I'm happy to do so. So when we think about tariffs, first thing we need to really think about that this is a tax on imports. So in actual fact, this should impact the price of cashew nuts for consumers in the United States. Now, it impacts the rest of the world because the United States is an important buyer. So the US consumes about 20% of the world's cashew nuts, and the US sources almost all of that, for now at least, in Vietnam. So we're talking about an increase caused by tariffs on retail prices in the United States, and how will that affect consumer demand? And what we've seen looking at the trends is that the US market has generally managed price increases quite well. So if we go back and if we look at the increase in imports over the years compared to prices, we generally see growth. So we are seeing the US market tending to grow regardless of higher prices. What changes is how quickly or how slowly the market grows in response to high prices. So when we see periods of high prices, we get slow growth. When we see periods of low prices, we tend to get high growth. But that happens slowly. What happens quickly is when there is a strong economic impact of some event. So in 2022, we got strong food inflation, strong energy inflation. It affected almost all countries, and that had a big impact on confidence. It had a big impact on buying, and more than anything, it caused very cautious approach by buyers because they were not sure where the next move was. So when we think of tariffs, we think of the reality in terms of the impact, of course, but we also think of its impact on sentiment. And one of the things that's been noticeable on the discussions, you see a lot of online discussions obviously nowadays, and it's good to see it. But one of the things that's noticeable is that people are not really sure what tariffs mean. So it is important to understand the basics. It's a tax on imports, it's delayed, it's part of a negotiation, it's absolutely not certain what will happen. We know that Vietnam has made a deal with the United States authorities that will mean that for now 20% is the tariff rate from Vietnam. But we also know that the small print is in there telling us that there could be a discussion or a renegotiation around agricultural products in the future. So when we look overall at the situation on tariffs into the United States, it is causing the price of cashews in the United States to be higher than they are elsewhere in the world. So you would have today markets like India, the highest priced market in the world. The US after tariffs would be next, and then the rest of the world would be after that. Some markets react more to price increases than to others. So we've noticed that the markets of West Asia react to price increases pretty quickly, but we've noticed that markets in Europe, for example, react less quickly to price increases and tend to react less. They continue to grow. They may grow a little bit more slowly. Markets like the United States tends to grow quite slowly during periods of high prices, but also is much more responsive to economic crisis. So what we really need to be watching here is the condition of the US economy and consumer sentiment in the US economy. If the economy is strong, we'll get much less of an impact on demand. This is a situation, in my view, that we need to watch carefully because of its impact on the US economy. Is this a threat to the market overall? By no means. We've seen price increases previously. We'll see them again. We will see lower prices. What it does, I think, is it adds a big question into the way our supply chain works and whether or not we can afford to have such a high level of cost by moving 3 million tons of cashew in Shell, Rorsey, and around the world every year, adding all those costs on. And that's something that is, and that's the kind of question that we'll look at when we look at the longer term trends when we talk again in August. Tariffs is a complex issue. We could talk all day. I feel I've already talked too much about it, so let me pass you back to Stella.
Thank you very much, Jim. Vietnam has negotiated to 10%. Is Cote d'Ivoire still at 20% tariff?
Yeah, I was checking today, and as far as I understand it, Cote d'Ivoire is that it's 21%, and that rate would kick in now in August. The moratorium at 10% continues until I think it's the 2nd of August. Thereafter, it would go up to 21%. Wouldn't be surprised to see that change. So far, to my knowledge, there's no agreement with Cote d'Ivoire. There may, of course, be negotiations going on, not aware of.
Thank you, Jim. Earlier, you mentioned that imports react slowly to price changes, but quickly to economic crisis. And you also mentioned that the key question is not the price increase caused by the tariffs, but the economic impact in the US. How do you see it by December 2025?
I gave a good guess on cashews, but I'm not going to guess on the US economy by the end of the year. That's not my expertise. What I'll say is that I think we will definitely see a reduction in US this year. I think there's no doubt on that. But that it may be as severe as that we've seen in of the year. So we've seen 30%, 27%, 22% down on the various months in the first 4 months of the year. That will improve, I think. Evidence of that would be we will significant imports to the United States this year. That's the case because last year's imports were so high. That lends us to a situation where we will have less imports in the US. So let's say US imports were down by, let's say they were by 15%. And the US consumes 20% of the world's cashews. So that would mean 20% of 20%. It's a 4% drop in consumption around the world. Will that be made up elsewhere? Evidence is, right now, yes, it will. If we look at consumption in India, consumption in Europe, consumption in China, we could see that quite easily made up in those countries. So we won't see growth this year, I feel. We will in specific markets, but the US will be a balancing factor on that. But what we are seeing is very interesting if you look at some of the statistics that are around on international trade at the moment. So, for example, we know that China, and this is not cashews, this is all trade. We know that China has reduced exports to the United States. They're down by about 10% this year so far. But their exports to other countries are up by 6%. There isn't a balancing there. Now, it does look as if we will see something along the same lines in the cashew sector. So I think that almost certain at this point that US imports will be lower for 2025. Does that mean that overall consumption is lower? Yes, but not as much as we might think, given what's happening. We're now not seeing the high prices that we saw at the end of last year. There's no more $3.45 FOB Vietnam. That's not there. At current prices, so let's say a range between 305 and 330 for 320s, that seems to work. So my feeling is that we will see a little bit of price volatility in the coming months, that it will settle, and we're not going to see a sharp decline in prices. But there are factors that could cause that. If European demand were to fall, and there's no indication of that, but if it were, if Chinese demand were to fall, if Indian demand were to fall, that would have an impact. But there is, let me stress, there is no indication of that happening right now. So I think a little bit of price stability returns. The incentive to do business on a forward basis is less. It's important that processors don't panic and start to drop prices, because as soon as you drop prices, buyers walk the other direction. I don't think 2025 is going to be a bad year, but I think 2026 will be a tough year, because that's when we'll see the impact of less demand and a surplus. So prices could be starting next year a little bit lower. They might even start a little bit lower in September and October when the trade from East Africa starts. Stella.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next webinar is on August 6th. What should we expect?
So on August 6th, what I'm proposing to do is take a lot of the subjects we've been talking about this year and have a look at the longer term perspective. So I'm going to have a look at long-term production trends, what's happening in Cambodia, what's happening in West Africa, East Africa. We're going to take some of the topics that we've been discussing today on demand and have a look at those over the longer term and how that will affect the trade. So what will this industry look like 10 years from now? How will this supply and demand balance? What if these trends continued? That's going to be looking at this question. I need to get working on this. This is going to take a long time to prepare, but that's August 6th, and I'm looking forward to that discussion. Hopefully, we'll see you online then. Thanks very much, Stella. Thank you very much for your support today. Thanks to all of the sponsors. See you next time.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for the great work as usual. And thank you to our partners and sponsors who made this webinar possible: the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and the Cashew Club. All the Global Markets Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick are available on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A, where you can watch 83 recordings anytime. And remember that the 19th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will take place from November 18th to 21st of this year at Jinek in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Register now and enjoy the 40% discount on all conference rates. And until August 6th, enjoy the 30 minutes networking session in the Q&A box. Bye.
Take care.
En Afrique et en Asie, augmenter la compétitivité des produits finis tout en réduisant la facture énergétique grâce à la valorisation de biomasse représente un enjeu économique majeur pour les pays, tant pour maximiser la valeur ajoutée nationale qu'en matière de création d'emplois. Ces industries peuvent par exemple concerner la transformation de la noix de cajou, du riz ou encore du bois. Néanmoins, la gestion des résidus de transformation et l'approvisionnement en électricité peuvent s'avérer compliqués et coûteux pour les industriels. Le projet AgroGazelec, appuyé par le Fonds français pour l'environnement mondial, a pour vocation de les valoriser en les transformant en électricité au sein même des agro-industries. S'ils sont gérés de manière durable, ces résidus deviennent une opportunité pour ces entreprises. Leur facture d'électricité est effacée et ils peuvent également bénéficier de revenus complémentaires avec la revente de biocharbon ou de l'excédent d'électricité sur le réseau électrique. L'objectif du programme est de développer une solution viable pour la valorisation des résidus agricoles et agro-industriels à travers leur gazéification et la production d'électricité dans des groupes électrogènes adaptés. De par sa modularité, cette technologie est adaptée pour des puissances entre 100 kW et 2 MW électriques. Cela passe notamment par la capitalisation d'expériences précédentes au Cambodge où IED Invest opère ce type de centrale depuis 2011 afin de transférer cette technologie ainsi que sa fabrication en Afrique de l'Ouest. La réalisation de projets pilotes permettra de mettre l'accent sur l'appropriation locale à travers de la formation et de répliquer ce modèle dans la sous-région, que ce soit à partir de coques d'anacarde, de balles de riz ou de résidus issus de la transformation du bois par exemple. Le programme AgroGazelec favorisera ainsi le développement du tissu économique local, la transition énergétique ainsi que la protection de l'environnement.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. MEA is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series,